Zaramba the position of Director of State Board Relations.
It's a proper motion. Do I have a second?
I second it.
Are you prepared to call the roll? Thank you.
Sorry.
No, we're pushing you.
Yes.
Board Member Flores?
Yes.
Board Member Goff?
Yes?
Board Member McClellan?
Yes.
Board Member Lincoln?
Yes.
Board Member Shuffle?
Yes.
Board Member Schroeder?
Yes.
That passes unanimously.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for all your hard work,
Okay.
you guys. Let's take a quick break. Give our staff time to set up.
5-minute break.
All right, I believe we are back to our afternoon session. Next item on our agenda is a presentation by CDE staff providing an overview of accountability statute and policy with a focus on school and district performance frameworks and topics included in HB 18-355. Commissioner, who will be presenting today, please?
Yes, we've got a whole crew. This is a work session, so we hope it's a little more informal and time to kind of dig into this. I'm going to start. Huh? It's up to you, Madam Chair. Would
First names. Informal.
informal? Okay. So I will be kicking us off, and then we've got Alan and Ashley and Marie and Katie, and they'll all kind of be, and Alyssa might be chiming in as well. This is really a time, since you guys will need to be making some decisions coming up here, to get grounded in what our current accountability system is. And we do want to go through it a little, so please, we beg your patience because we know you know a lot of this. However, it's good to get grounded in what is. And though, there are just a lot of components of our accountability system, and since we only usually talk about a few, we wanted to make sure you were grounded in the whole perspective. And so we're going to go through that. Then we're going to get some feedback on sort of your philosophy of accountability, because that's really going to drive how we look at options and how we kind of put options in front of you when you get into the decision-making mode. And then we're also going to give you an update more on our technical advisory panel, which is statutorily required for making a recommendation to you on the growth to standard metric. And the growth to standard metric is just one component of sort of the rule making. But we think it's probably the most, it's probably the area you'll want to focus on most, because it may be able to hit a lot of your other questions. So that's what we're going to do today. Any questions about that? All right, so we're just going to dive in, and I'm actually going to do the first part. I don't know why they gave this to me, but maybe it's a test on what our current system is. Our current accountability system is all based on the 2009 legislation of 163. And it authorizes CDE to conduct an annual review of the performance of public schools and districts in the state, and then to make recommendations to you all concerning the type of school improvement plan to be implemented in each school and the accreditation category for each district. So moving on, I think I have the flicker. This is hard to see, so you may have to look at it on your, these are the next three pieces are kind of the specifics in the legislative declaration. I'll just point out, we're actually going to let you guys review this a little bit. I'm not going to read each of these things to you, but I think the important thing that we wanted to say today is 163 was a pretty big shift from the accountability system before 163, and Katie, Lanaha, or Alyssa, or maybe even some of the other ones could talk about that. But we really used to have a system that was really mostly based on student achievement, if not solely based on student achievement. And 163 really moved us into a realm of saying student growth and how students are growing is an important part of our system. And so that's one of the big shifts there. And then you'll see that a lot of the focus in the legislative declaration is around continuous improvement, around sort of, we highlighted some of the words around the fair, balanced, cumulative, credible, a focus on learning, objectively evaluates the performance, these sorts of things. And the legislative declaration is, we've got 3 different slides here. So I think what we want to do is, and did we put it on a sheet of paper? Okay. We also wrote it out for you just on one sheet of paper for your review. But what we want to do is have you guys just read this a little bit, and then we're going to ask you, after you've read this and absorbed it a little bit, where your focus is in the short and long term around this, with regards to potential adjustments or improvements moving forward. So where you would like to have us focus on this moving forward. So I think first we just want you to read this legislative declaration intent from 163, because that is the law we're currently operating under. And then we're going to ask you for some questions after this. So go ahead and just kind of review this briefly.
So Katie, I did read this, but I didn't realize at the time, this is what's actually in the bill, in the declaration, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, because there was some terminology that
Right.
surprised me.
Do you guys know you guys probably know better than me. The legislative declaration it's in a little more user-friendly language than if you dove into all of the terminology in the bill. So we kind of used the declaration as a starting point.
It's the top
Yep.
part of the bill.
Yep.
It's the only part I ever understand.
Yep. Does anybody need more time, or? Wanna go through it? So I think one of the first questions we just wanted to know is what, based on what you read in the 163 declaration, what do you think our system is currently doing well in these areas? You know, what do you think is working?
The identification of the neediest students, is it okay to just jump in?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So for me, under what resonates, it would be part 2, subsection D. Getting the data necessary to assist the neediest students in making more than a year's academic growth in a year's time so that these students can catch up to the academic performance levels of their peers.
But we also find that there's not, there's more kids that need help than we appropriate monies for. So it's not that, I think we could be doing better if we had more resources for all the schools that need the help. And I think that's one of the things that's sort of missing here.
Thanks.
So what resonated with me is that this attempts to say it is about support. As Rebecca suggested, that it is designed not to be punitive. When in fact, not sure that's the understanding. But I think it's a really important part that it is designed for support. It's designed to acknowledge the importance of the standards. I mean, why do we have the standards? Why do we have this? This is to ensure that these standards are in fact meaningful for the kids in Colorado. So those are things that resonated with me.
Yeah, Jane?
I've always, ever since we went back to the use of post-secondary instead of college and career all the time, I don't know. I think that threw us off for a little while because the Cap for K and this particular bill, they established the post-secondary word, and I just think it left us a lot more flexibility to talk about that after high school is more than a 4-year college degree. But then we went into the college and career ready, and it sort of kind of hijacked some conversations a little bit. But that's just the words. I find it interesting now to read. I'm reading this again, and maybe we've also, it resonates because I wonder how it's been perceived. We talk about academic gaps, and we talk about achievement gaps, and we talk about growth gaps. And to me, I'm just wondering how many people are seeing those as 3 different types of thing. And if we're going to have more of an emphasis on one or not, if we're going to change our emphasis. So, because we've talked a lot about, let's do something about, I don't know if the right word, depends how you use the word, decreasing or increasing, decreasing the gaps in achievement gaps, get them out of our way. But if that's different, because that could be just purely the academic portion of the accountability system. So if we're gonna emphasize from now on, or if we always have and we just haven't squared it up maybe, what's the difference in putting a focus on growth gaps? Because it could involve a little bit different take on things.
May I add to that? Because it is correlated with what she said. May I
Go ahead,
please?
sure.
I think that strictly measuring academics and rating schools based only on academic performance misses the forest for the trees. But surely we need to hold schools accountable for academics. But also we must demand that we consider our democratic values of equity and equal opportunity for all our students, no matter the color of their skin or their parents' pocketbooks. We must also demand that our schools meet our expectations of what our democracy should look like. And by this I mean well-integrated schools. Now, this may not be for all congressional districts, but I think in the Front Range, and especially in my school district, we are very segregated, in just incredibly segregated. And I just can't imagine that, now I'm going to criticize a local board, that they cannot find measures by which we can, have kids more integrated than we have. And I really do feel that integration is very important. I mean, this was the basis of Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, and I think we've kind of given up on that. And I really believe that we can't stop and not fight for this very important democratic value of ours, of getting our kids integrated, which means that they're getting an equal opportunity and equity. That's what I'm talking about
Right.
specifically.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Flores. I think that's really important, and I think one of the other things I neglected to mention was we're going to take all these notes on sort of philosophy and stuff, and then when we organize it, we're going to say, here's what we heard from you all, here's what we can do in board rule, here's what is more a statutory conversation, and here is more an important philosophical discussion that should continue to be had. So we will kind of be organizing your ideas in those areas.
Thank you.
So,
Just
Jane.
a technical question. You all that have been living with this recently, is this declaration, the declaration in 163, did that change? It didn't.
We
Okay,
just
so
haven't read it.
we're just looking at.
We're just
seeing-
refreshing it.
Yep, that's really a good idea.
Yeah.
Just wanted
That's a
to
good
reground
idea.
ourselves.
Yeah.
And one of the purposes of this session today is that we'd like to get direction from board members, so we can determine kind of what models to run, what conversations to bring back to you, like Katie mentioned. And so we thought that kind of a grounding in the declaration to see what resonates currently, and then what are areas that we don't feel our current system is addressing, and we want to look into or focus on, would be helpful direction for our team moving forward.
Yeah.
Rebecca?
Do we need to use a microphone?
I think we do, because I think we're on recording.
Yeah, or live feed. If I'm open to staff input in the event that once you've kind of gotten a bit of a picture from us, piece by piece or pixel by pixel, if it looks like there's a blind spot or something that we're missing,
Yeah.
maybe because we thought it was assumed that everybody felt this way, I'm open to hearing what areas of the picture we need to fill in maybe. But for me, I'm thinking the kids that are farthest behind or need the most help, that's where I'm feeling like the Department of Education's policy making and rule making energy or policy influencing, I should say, and rule making energy needs to kind of focus.
So, Katie, are you on the second piece, the potential areas of focus?
Yeah, yeah.
So I looked at it, one was to continue the focus on growth, but at the same time, how to ensure that growth ultimately does lead to proficiency. And finally, then attention to the gaps within school, within district.
Good.
What kind of gaps?
And what kind of
Achievement gaps,
just need-
achievement,
So
achievement
if
gaps
we're
and growth
We're
gaps. both.
strictly on the achievement, literally, to me, that's the concrete one. The
Mhm.
other one's the
It's the end.
burrows on the side of the road, it's just, I don't know.
Any other areas of focus?
Yeah.
And Jane, did you have something right before that?
Well, kind of, in response to Rebecca's, which I totally agree with, that put the focus where the needs are. But to kind of react to some things we've been hearing ever since this law came into effect, there are needs at all levels of achievement. So, if, you know, we can't just, people are not expecting us to keep sort of glossing over the middle, or the higher end, the higher achievement end. And so I think that's always a concern. You know, how do we word things, or how do we address things that that really address needs, period. So the higher achieving end, they also have needs for, you know, continued growth. And how do we pinpoint that as well as?
I think there are parents in our
Yeah.
communities that look, that take the time, a lot of time for those kids. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't, but of course, there's a lot of help at that end, I believe. But
Well,
there's.
we can believe a lot of things. I mean, you know, we're talking about designing our system of
Right.
holding our system accountable.
Well.
And it's like, I think we have a responsibility to always keep it in mind.
Rebecca?
I do agree with Board Member Goff's comments. I also want to just kind of sound a note of caution when we're talking about high achieving kids. That can be the other end of the spectrum on mental health concerns. If we accidentally or insensitively send the message that nothing is ever fully good enough, in other words, you're at the very, very top, but remember, we expect more. There can be, I want to be careful, we're not participating in setting a tone that encourages kids to lose perspective. So, and I don't know how you balance that within the messaging about growth even for our very high achieving students. I'm not sure I have the perfect answer, but I hope that we're sensitive to the fact that that can be a concern for some students.
Anybody else
Joyce?
have any?
Joyce, do you have some comments?
I mean, they're all great words. If this was all put into effect at every single school, I think we'd have a different picture than what we have today. The one I really think has come an extremely long way, and to me I think is a strength of this bill, is the report's performance in clear, readily understandable terms. The colors, all these things that make sense to the general public, and they're the ones paying the tax dollars. I think that's very good. That's not to say that we didn't learn a lot, because our schools are all excellent, but our kids can't read. I mean, that's a big generalization, but what I'm saying is it really did point out some areas in our program that we need to work on. We really do, and a lot of it is just communication with the public and what it is they want. I mean, but anyway, that to me was one of the big strengths. I don't understand availability of technical assistance. I don't even know what that looks like, but.
I think that's more how we work with, that when schools are identified, a big idea was when schools are identified, we would support them. We would get, with grants and those sorts of things that we've been doing.
I just wanted to ask a question. Have we really reached consensus on what competency or proficiency is in this test? Or are we just waiting for, you know, that time when, you know, one knows time elapses after the test has been in operation for several years, say 5 years, and then say, well, you know, here is what grade level kids are at grade level. I mean, we have said that, I don't know, 50% or whatever is grade level or whatever.
Well, yeah, our tests do have sort of grade level equivalents associated with them, and so
Right.
we do have that, and so we're using the CMAS tests and the PSAT and the SAT to determine those things. So that's what we're currently using, and our CMAS at least is very aligned with the NAEP test. in terms of those grade levels. And so they are, that would be a whole other session on digging into
Right.
our assessment and what the scores mean and everything like that. But that's what we are currently using, and that's what's in the law around the Accountability Act. But, it could be a parking lot item to keep discussing that's sort of out of the scope of the accountability rules.
Yeah, but we did find out, I mean, when I looked at the test, and it still hasn't gone away from my thinking, is that, math is based, our math test is based on reading. So are we really measuring, that hasn't gone away from my thinking. Are we
Yeah.
really measuring math, or are we really measuring reading ability in math? And the other is, well,
I think those are really important. And also just know that we had, like, educator judgment was a big part of that process around what was met and what there was a big, long process that,
right.
we could talk about at another time, but certainly important pieces to
Right.
bring up. And that is, those tests are what this system is based on. So partially, I want to be careful.
Should be.
And so, but
And-
thank you.
And also, the other thing that I can't get over, because it's still, I still think about it, is that we have four grades. And I would like to see 5 grades.
Okay. And you
I-
mean
I-
of the districts and the schools, the levels that we.
The levels,
yeah.
the levels. I still think that would make it more comprehensible by the public. And I think it would give a little more justice to individual students as well.
Okay. Thank you. I think that one, yeah, that one would be
Yeah.
in the statute category.
Is there any way to?
But we will actually talk about that today.
Yeah, yeah,
So-
okay.
So, that's probably in the middle of the
Yeah.
conversation.
Thank you.
So,
Yeah.
that's a good sense. Did any of you, Steve, did you want to chime in or anything? No?
No,
Not right now? Okay.
So we're still fans of growth.
We're still fans of growth. Okay, we heard that.
We're still
Mhm.
grabbing a hold of it.
Yeah,
Yeah, we think
Okay.
growth is important.
okay,
Well,
okay.
but
But
I
we
do-
heard-
I do honor other things that we've had, conversations we've had before today about how do we justify good growth and we still have the everyday thing about we don't have enough kids who can read well. I mean,
Well, the
The
added measure, I hope is gonna help us, the one that's
Yes.
growth, true
Yeah, that's-
proficiency.
Right.
I mean, I think that's what's been, has felt like it's
Right.
been neglected.
is it on
Right.
its way to coming
Are
together?
we getting there?
And the other thing, do we have, we have a lot of experimentation going on out there, and is that being shared? I'm not saying it's negative. I'm thinking that when we have charter schools and they are doing new curricula and new skills testing and, but are we sharing that with other public? With the public as a whole, especially when I hear from some districts that are saying, well, they're still grappling with curricula. And is there enough help? Do we have ways by which district to district discussions take place
Yeah.
about what is working, especially with similar populations?
Yeah.
If there can be some.
Yeah, that's a great point, and we do have that through our Connect for Success grant, that you almost exactly defined that process by
Thank you.
connecting districts with that. But I think that's also a good thing to capture in our notes around how we're how we're highlighting and spotlighting the folks that are doing well and connecting them with folks that maybe still need some ideas and support. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so we know some of you have a hard stop, so we're gonna keep plugging away. We're gonna move into sort of the way we've been doing this, and I think I'm gonna turn it over to Ashley at this point. But just wanted to put my 2 cents in there that the performance frameworks are one part of the system, right? So that was also why we wanted to ground you in the legislative intent. There's a whole lot of other parts of the system, and we're gonna focus a little bit on the performance frameworks because that's where you guys have some of the impact. And so Ashley's gonna walk us through the model we're using, and then we'll pause to hear your thoughts on how we're doing this work.
So the legislative declaration was more focused on the frameworks themselves, but then we wanted to kind of bring it up a level to show where the frameworks fit in the larger accountability system here in our state. And I think you each have a handout of this. It's a little small on the screen, but if you can probably read it on your handouts. I think they have it though. Yeah. But this is a draft theory of action around our accountability system here in the state, and so this was developed internally. It was shared with some schools and districts, but that's as far as we've gone so far. So we're sharing it with you today with the purpose of trying to get some feedback around, again, what kind of resonates with you in this model, and then what are some things potentially that are missing or that are not called out that need to be included in the model. And then to walk through really quickly, this is really based on the statute that we just reviewed. So that phrase in the top, Colorado system of school and district accountability is primarily designed to provide valid and actionable information regarding the progress of all students toward meeting the state academic standards and prioritize support for schools and districts identified for academic improvements. That's a really short summation of what we read in the legislative declaration. And then it's really based off of the continuous improvement model. And so at both the state and the local level, there's a cycle of steps that we go through on an annual basis, and at the local level, even more often. And so we start with evaluating, and this is where schools and districts analyze state data along with their local data that's more contextualized for their local context. And the state provides school and district performance frameworks. And so with those frameworks, we do recognize those areas of success. We have awards for those schools that show success with their academic data. And then it's also how CDE prioritizes support based on student academic outcomes. The next step is assessing needs and planning. And so at the local level, that's where schools and districts work with their communities to assess their needs and select strategies to support continuous improvement. And this happens at all of our schools and districts, whether they're in performance or in turnaround. And then at the state level, CDE does support the unified improvement planning process for all schools and districts, which is also informed by state and local data. And then that last step there is implementation. So at the local level, this is where the work happens. It's where schools and districts apply for additional resources and implement selected strategies for improvement. At the state level, CDE works to allocate resources and supports in alignment with school and district needs that are identified in those unified improvement plans. And so this is the cycle that we go through on an annual basis. On the bottom right-hand corner is a reference to Performance Watch, or the accountability clock, so that's intervention. At the local level, it's when consistently low-performing schools and districts take more rigorous action if student performance remains low. And the State Board of Education works with CDE and districts to determine more rigorous action steps for persistently low-performing systems through the Performance Watch process. And so this is trying to take what is a lot of statute and a lot of action, both at the local and state level, and map it out to a process that's at the highest level possible. And so what we wanted to do is take maybe 2 or 3 minutes to get feedback from you all on what you think about this, if this is kind of an accurate summation of what we're driven, or what we're doing based on statute, plus what's actually happening on the ground. And if there's anything that you notice that is missing or that's not called out here that would be important to highlight.
I would just say that when I read the declaration, there was a term in there that I just don't think is operative, and that is that we reward. we celebrate, which is what we do next Wednesday or other times, but we don't actually have a system in 163 that rewards. And I'm not even sure exactly, we reward growth sometimes, we reward performance
We celebrate and
achievement.
we praise, and that's a form of reward.
Well, it depends, but I think the term celebrate or some other word, but you're not gonna
Yeah.
change the declaration. I just think that from my mind, there's a little bit of a disconnect, because we talk in other proposed legislation about actually rewarding districts that achieve certain things.
Yeah.
And usually it's rewards with grants or funds or something other than celebrate.
Yeah.
So, you can't change it, Val. I'm not trying to change it. I'm just trying to acknowledge that there's just a little bit of a disconnect in the terminology that's in the declaration from the legislature compared to what we actually do,
Mhm.
how it came out.
And we heard a lot of that feedback from the field as well, is that
Did you?
yes,
Okay.
so we do have awards, right, for achievement and growth, but there's a lot of focus
Yep.
on the support
They're not worth a
intervention
cup of
piece.
coffee,
Yeah,
actually.
exactly.
On the intervention part,
Sorry. I'm just so used to it.
on this
My
first
name.
top three, I think of that as a continuous or yearly or more locally. But then when I get down to that intervene, that's like, now maybe I'm wrong, but isn't that 5 years?
Well, it was 5 years. I think it's modified at this point with
Yeah,
the
that's-
bill from last year.
It's referencing the accountability clock, so that's 5 years
Yeah,
of
yeah, so
low performance before the.
is that, that's the intervention we're talking about here.
Yeah.
But this one above it, I think of that as more ongoing than, okay, now 5 years has come up, now let's take a look at this. So
Yes.
I would separate those two more by
Would it,
years, longevity.
Rebecca,
What?
what? Joyce? I went Rankin, I don't know how to get, anyway.
Yeah.
Would it help to say the clock in this bottom section,
If-
rather
if-
than intervene?
It could, and we
Or
can also add the
something else.
timing piece to it. We
Yeah,
could
it's just
say,
a timing,
This is
yeah,
the
yeah.
annual, this is the annual process.
Or
this is what
ongoing or
happens.
whatever.
To clarify, yeah.
Yeah, I think
Having them on the same page was really.
well, and I don't know, I'll check with you guys, but, we do try to intervene a little earlier than the end of the 5-year clock. So it gets to
Oh, yeah,
you at
that's
the
right.
end,
Yeah.
but remember that when we start seeing folks come on, we reach out to them in different ways.
And
And
sometimes
we,
they reach out to us.
and sometimes they reach out to
earlier
us,
than-
and they become eligible for certain supports that other schools and districts aren't. So I do think this intervene category is encompassing a little bit more.
Can I
Right.
speak to that?
And
Just-
1355 also requires,
We're gonna have more of that
yeah,
anyway.
earlier activities in 5 years.
Excuse me.
Alan?
So what I would add to what Katie was saying is, so within that first 5 years, ideally, in a perfect world, what we would like to see is for schools and districts and us as a State Department to be able to engage in that process before we get to that 5-year mark, right? And support schools to make the shifts, give them the resources, whatever it is that provides a school or district to get off of performance watch. Ultimately, that would be the goal of an accountability system that is supportive across the whole, because to your point, Joyce, this is continuous improvement, and really in a district, that's what we should be doing all the time, is continually trying to improve our systems and our processes and get better at the work that we do. And then with the identification of those that need intervention, try to support that within that first 5 years so that we don't get to the point where it could potentially end up, so.
So the arrow that goes from the bottom to the top, out to the side of that might be CD support, optional CD
Absolutely.
support, and because that can come at any time
Right.
in this process.
Absolutely.
And I know we've, at some group, I know, is it the evaluation group or the research group that's looked into this, and that is to reward in some way, and it may be a certificate, it may be, I think reward comes in many forms, and just attention paid is a reward to those schools who have made gains that one would say that statistically are, you know, kind of way and above. And I'm talking about schools that are, you know, that don't have the resources, where they're economically poor, where they may be rural, they may be minority, they may have special needs, special ed needs and such, where we reward those schools as well for, you know, in any way possible, so that they can keep that choo-choo going.
Momentum, yep. Good, thank you.
I just wanted to jump in and just kind of note that I know we've had some districts that have come forward to us early, and I just want to reiterate my hope that because none of these interventions, I hope, are in any way intended to be punitive, but rather they are intended to help where whatever is happening isn't working, and to target resources for the kids who need the help the most, so that ultimately we get the results we're all hoping for. My hope is that when they come to us early, that doesn't become an avenue for negotiating a less rigorous or careful process. So, just wanted to voice that.
Mhm.
Been on the outskirts of a couple conversations.
Okay. and-
Okay. Oh,
Steve?
oh,
I think in the interventions we've had, in virtually all of the interventions, I think they've been viewed largely as punitive, and I don't think there's any way around that, because what do we want? We want people to change what they're doing. Change is always, I think, viewed in a negative light, particularly by those who have an interest in maintaining the status quo, which is essentially everyone involved in the system and trying to protect what they've been doing. So I think it's going to be perceived, the intent is not negative, the intent is to drive a positive result. But the perception isn't going to change, and we shouldn't delude ourselves into believing that anything that's going to happen, if we actually do something meaningful in Adams 14 or Pueblo, or the things we've done in Cortez and other places, I think is perceived ultimately as negative, although I think in Cortez they do believe my understanding that we've tried to be as helpful as we can. We've provided some resources, and so we may have taken the edge off that. But whenever you insist on change, you're not going to be the popular kid at the party.
You know, Steve, I think that's true at the front end when it's first brought forward. But very often, once the engagement of that change moves forward, there's a shift, and it ceases to be punitive. It becomes an opportunity. That mental shift from, oh gosh, now we got to do this. I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it. I have to do it. Doggone that State Board of Education for forcing us to do it. There comes a time where there is a recognition that, wow, things are changing, and they are changing for our kids, and we can do this. I think I can, and then I can. So I agree with you that initially it does look punitive. It's not entirely punitive, because very often people really change.
I do absolutely agree with that analysis, but we live at the front end of this
We
process.
do live at that
not the back
process.
end. And so
Well, if we show up at the end, though,
it's,
We live at both ends of the process.
Yeah.
And,
Well-
and when you really get to the
Maybe-
far end,
I think
Maybe it was
staff
five.
lives at both ends, and the middle as well. I think the board is in a slightly different position. We live primarily at the front end, because that's where we receive the adverse commentary. I mean, we're already
That's true.
seeing a lot of it with some of the coming decisions. So it's whether it's intended to be negative, and I think I shared Dr. Schroeder's view that it's intended to be very positive, but the
Takes a while.
chances of it ever being perceived that way
initially.
while we're going through it is almost non-existent.
It's human beings.
It's
being
human beings. Welcome.
Yeah.
So I've been smart enough
Nobody
to,
likes to be-
I've been smart enough to visit a school after it's gone through that, which is
Yeah.
so great, because that is celebratory. So next week, that should feel celebratory
Yes.
to some folks. right? I mean, you're right, we're at the tough end.
You know, the thing is, I heard you, and I'm thinking, what is Steve talking about? What is Mr. Durham talking about? Is he talking about the 1950s and 60s when high schools were going through, you know, mechanically, they had all these wonderful places where kids could really have a choice as to going into the fields of work that they wanted to, other than college, or are you talking about what's happening now with, you know, the offerings in technology and all the other offerings that we have? I mean, things change, and I almost think that what we're going through right now in offering internships and getting kids to go to work and such were what was happening back in the 60s, and then we kind of went retrograde. And so it's kind of flowering again. And so I see that as change, and we've gone through it, and it's positive.
That's not the change we're talking about.
Well, then name it. I mean, I
The change
hate
we're
to-
talking about is the intervention, is this piece right here. That's the change we're talking about. What I put on mine here, and is the notion of continuous improvement. I mean, I don't know that that's part of our culture. I think successful school districts, it's part of their culture. And I would want them to look at it that way rather than as being just punitive or just being authoritative. And that's the other part. It's not just what we do out here, but the fact that we require an UIP and that sort of stuff feels sometimes as though we're being authoritative and just telling folks what to do, but in fact the intention is to give guidance for effective continuous improvement model.
I do have a question. How often
Sure.
does a unified improvement plan have to be done annually?
Big districts, yes.
It does for most, and then there are a few folks.
Is that a federal
Yeah.
requirement
Yeah.
primarily?
Go ahead, Ashley, whoever wants to.
Is that primarily a federal
I
requirement?
don't.
Yeah, and the performance ones have flat, so just come, yeah, come up and share.
So what we've done, and hence the name Unified, we've brought together state and federal requirements. So some of this is federal, some of this is state. So there is some flexibility built in through the state requirements or the state statute. And this actually gets to some of your reward conversation, and that is when schools and districts are at the performance level, then they have the ability to do and update their planning on a biennial basis, so every other year. So I
So
think a
that's a
reward is,
reward,
yeah, a
sure.
reward
It's a
is
reward.
some added flexibility. But otherwise it's done at least, it's expected that things are updated at least annually. And then if they're on the accountability clock, so priority improvement or turnaround, CDE is reviewing and providing feedback. And then at points, certain points expecting certain things are updated quickly, like especially if they're about to come to you guys. And then that we're able to incorporate a lot of the federal requirements in there as well at the same time. And in those cases, it is expected annually, at least once.
Well, it seems to me that I don't think anyone will disagree that education is one of the more highly bureaucratized enterprises in the United States, and I think we've learned that central planning is generally a failure. So now we have, instead of central planning, we have mandated decentralized planning. I wonder if it isn't as much an exercise as it is something that produces results. I know it consumes lots of resources when you look at the size of the documents that come flowing through, and we have to review them, and somebody has to produce them. I think we should take a hard look at some of these activities and make sure we're doing things that don't soak up resources and fail to deliver measurable outcomes.
So here's the rub, Steve. If you have a school where one person fills out the UIP, that's really worthless. But when you have a school where you have a school improvement team, where you have a team of teachers, where you have a fair number of parents participating in looking at the data of the school and setting some goals of what they want for their kids, it may create a product, and that might bother you, but in fact, the process they're in is extremely engaging, and that's how you create a school culture that is positive, that includes parents, that parents understand why kids are doing certain things, learning certain things. So it can be a hugely positive, engaging process, and it's actually, I think it's intended to be that way. It is true that every now and then, and I do remember a school where the assistant principal tried to fill it out and answer all the federal questions, et cetera, and that just blew up. Fortunately, it blew up because that was never the intent of it. It wasn't a good product. But I think the intent actually behind there is a process that is supposed to be really helpful, not just a product, and I think what you're looking at is the product. So the UIPs, nobody looks at, we don't look at any of those unless the school or the district is in priority or turnaround.
So I would say.
Is that accurate? We don't look at them?
We.
They submit them and we, what, pile them on a shelf someplace?
No,
or-
the principals and the school boards look at them.
So we publicly post all of the plans, so that's a service that we provide to all schools and districts, because that's part of one of the tenets of the Accountability Act. We also frequently get requests from schools and districts to review them, even if they're not on the clock. So we provide that as an added service. But really, the expectation is that is something that actually Angelica described it well. The expectation is really that it's a locally owned process. I will add that there are several programs that have the requirements met through the improvement planning process. So things like gifted education, the READ Act, and they will review the plans for their requirements a little bit independently. So while our office for these purposes, we focus a little bit more on priority improvement and turnaround. There are programs, rather than having a separate plan, are able to get their requirements and able to do their reviews through a single plan. So there are other state and federal requirements and grant programs that are also looking at the plans as well. Can I add just a couple other things? We really are striving to not have it be a bureaucratic process, and we know that there's times when if it's treated that way, that's how it ends up. We've worked to pull this into an online system so that we're able to pull in, use technology to support the planning process so that things are naturally brought over, that people aren't spending their time cutting and pasting, that it
Yeah,
really
what's
is
the term? They're
that we pre-populate
pre-populated so that you don't,
Yeah.
they're not looking up data that's right there anyway.
So this is where technology actually I think has been helpful. And we're constantly in touch with the field. We have advisor groups trying to help us understand when it does become more bureaucratic, how can we reduce that? So we're always very open to reducing burden. We don't want that to be a barrier. We really do want it to be more of like what Angelica described. And so, we're working toward that. It's a continuous improvement process, I guess is what I want
Well,
to say.
and then the other part of that is, as I started to say, that school boards should be looking at their school's UIP in order to understand what's really going on, not just in the aggregated data that's given to them at the district level, but also in particular areas, just to look for things where there should be some attention. Some do and some don't.
Well, school boards should be looking at results.
That's in there.
And-
That's what's in the UIP.
No, that's not what's in the UIP.
What?
School boards should be looking at results, not planning for next year. They should be insisting on results, and then if they don't get those results, then they should be forcing change to achieve those results, and that probably can be done by a plan if the plan is not controlled by those who want to continue the status quo.
So the UIP is pre-populated with the current data. And then you can keep looking at it and keep watching it, and you have collective data to see whether the results are coming, so that if it doesn't give the information that you need to do exactly what you just suggested, then it doesn't have any value.
May I speak?
Yeah.
Thank you. One of the things I think that's missing here, and that I've heard a lot about, and in fact, anytime we meet with other board members around the state, it always comes up, and I don't know why I'm the person they tell this to, but we need to work on boards. And I know that
Whoa.
we need to work on boards. If we're just, and the stories I hear are just unbelievable about boards. They don't read, or somebody is just, kind of filling in, and because it kind of sounds like they get elected, sort of like in junior high, queens and it's not pretty. It's not pretty, and I think that if there's that much disorder and going on out there with boards, that somehow the legislature, if we can't do anything about that in training and such, we can't just talk about the bottom half when, let's say, the top half is not running and functioning well. And I think we need to talk about that. Somehow, somewhere, we need to talk about getting training for these people. Because I think they want it, and it may not be.
Board Member Flores, we do think that's a good point. I think we added some of that in the most recent legislation. Not that we can require it, because we constitutionally, I don't think we can, but that we put in the most recent version of the legislation, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, there is a strong recommendation to have board training. So
Yeah,
I think that's
because
important.
The boards are
Yep.
themselves are talking about the dysfunction and the need for it.
Yeah, okay. Well, I know we want to keep moving, so we're just going to do this one slide and do a quick, and then a quick break. And then-
So that was great feedback. So we took notes on that, and we are adjusting the theory of action currently. So we'll take that feedback into consideration. And we actually did hear a lot of similar themes from the work sessions or the sessions that we had with stakeholders across the state. So wanted to take a couple of minutes to review that. And just let you know that we have a survey that's currently open on our website it's going to be closing as soon as we notice rules. So we have 2 more weeks until that happens. We also have more stakeholder sessions that are happening this month. And so once those are all completed, we want to compile all the results and just send you everything so you can see what was said. But at a very high level, we have, from October through now, hosted 31 in-person stakeholder feedback sessions focused on state accountability, and we collected feedback on a host of topics, including the theory of action. But at a high level, based on what we've talked about so far, what we've heard from folks kind of across the board, really, is around the importance of communicating the purpose of accountability and the theory of action. So that kind of sparked us to create that previous slide. Because when we talk about the frameworks, a lot of questions we get is well, what's the purpose of the frameworks, and where do they fit in the entire system? And so we tried to make that a little more visual with that theory of action. We hear a lot about how the performance frameworks are not the entire picture of school health or district health. And so where do local measures fit into our state's accountability system? And so we did, if you notice in the previous slide, a couple of times mention this is where local data comes in, this is where local data comes in, to try to really be a little more concrete about how state data can work with local data for local decision makers. So that's where that came from. We heard a lot about that. And then we heard a lot about growth versus achievement as well, which we heard from this conversation with you all so far, about how our stakeholders across the state value achievement, and how they use that achievement indicator, and also how they value growth and how that's used in practice. And we'll go a little bit deeper into that in our next session as well.
Ashley, where does that show up? In here? Is it in this theory of action that we include
Growth.
mention of other district data?
Well, in that slide, so under assess needs and plan, and also under evaluate, if you look on the local side, it mentions local data. So that's as far as it goes, and we had a conversation yesterday with exec team about how can we make that even more explicit to talk
Well,
about.
it says school districts work with local communities to assess needs and select strategic support to support continuous improvement.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't talk about,
Local, so if you go up to evaluate, it says schools and districts analyze state and local data, and that's probably the place where it's most.
There we go. Okay, and the
clearly
perception,
stated.
okay, so my brain went to local assessments.
Yeah.
That wasn't right. I don't know if you wanna expand that or not, but that's where my brain went,
Yeah.
because
Mhm.
I think that's great feedback. And we
very
actually
often with
talked about
one
that, yeah.
sixty-three,
Yep.
with requests to reconsider,
Yep.
it's all about that. It's not about to my knowledge, it's not about this other broad conversation that's ongoing now
Yeah.
about the importance of other data that we want to in some way reflect in our state to our communities.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
That isn't where I went
Okay,
when I read that.
that's helpful.
Yeah, that's really helpful feedback. And when it's 2 words, but we're trying to convey that it is local assessments plus anything else that the district wants to prioritize and thinks is important,
Mhm.
right, for the local community. So we can definitely be more explicit about that. And I think that's all we have for that section, actually. So we are
How-
scheduled to take a
How
small
many
break.
people participated in this survey? Unique visitors on that site?
97 so far.
Thank you.
Do you mind sharing with us the questions,
Yes, we can do
please?
that. Mhm. Yep.
You do mind, or you don't?
No,
Oh,
we will
do not
share,
mind,
we
we
do
can
not
share
mind.
them.
I read them all.
Yes, we do.
Right.
Right.
know. Guess we might. Well, and it's up to you, board members, if you want to take a break now, or the next section, we had slotted about 35 minutes to go into our performance indicators. Do you want to keep moving? Or
Well, if you're the only one, I'll stand pat.
No, 5 minutes?
take a 5-minute break?
Yeah,
Sure.
Just make it 5 minutes.
Sure.
Just either.
Okay.
bomb that's gonna go off?
So now we're gonna have our
Deep dive.
resident, are we moving to Marie now? Okay, our resident smarty on performance indicators.
And so we're gonna take the next probably 25 minutes to review the board rule that outlines specific components of the performance frameworks in preparation for rulemaking. So that's the rule that we'll be interacting with during rulemaking. Specifically, we're gonna take a deeper look in, or a deeper dive into the types of data that are included in the framework. So that's growth data, achievement, growth to standard, and post-secondary workforce readiness. So the first set of slides are really a review of board rule for each of those indicators. And just kind of a warning, it's gonna be a little quick and a lot of us talking, but we're gonna get through
We
that.
have seen this before.
Yes,
Yep.
we're gonna get through that and then open it up for an example and activity and conversation again.
It's still you.
Oh yeah, it's still me. So the first step within Colorado's accountability system is to describe the current performance of school districts, the Charter School Institute, and public schools across the state, and evaluate if the performance meets state expectations. So state statute and board rule provide the authority and lay out the required components of this reporting and evaluation system, which is known as the school and district performance frameworks. Oh, I forgot about all these slides, it's funny. So, to start with the overall structure of the frameworks, every school and district does receive a rating. So schools receive a plan type, and that's where we see performance, improvement, priority improvement, and turnaround. Districts receive those accreditation ratings. So the districts have 4 categories plus the distinction, that blue rating at the top. Those ratings are determined by a school or a district's performance within what we call performance indicators, and those are achievement, growth to standard, and post-secondary workforce readiness. And so we're going to spend some time this afternoon actually talking about the ratings themselves. So the 4 ratings we have for schools and the 5 that we have for districts. We're also going to spend some time talking about the weighting of those performance indicators that feed into the overall ratings. And so you see on the right-hand side, for example, for elementary and middle school right now, we have 60% of those points coming from growth, 40% coming from achievement. We won't spend any time really today talking about the sub-indicators, but just a quick reminder, actually within each of those performance indicators, so for example within English language arts, there are sub-indicators. So within English language arts, within achievement, we look at math data, English language arts, and science. So those are the 3 sub-indicators that feed into achievement. But we're going to be focusing most of our time on those performance indicators, so talking about the weighting on the frameworks, and then also the ratings, which are the end product of those frameworks.
So Ashley, on the,
Yes.
on the upper right-hand side,
Yes.
that's the most recent year,
Yes,
the ratings distribution.
it is. And it's been a similar distribution for the past few years, so
It's consistent.
It is consistent, yes.
Thank you.
All right, so now I'm going to pass it to Marie, who's going to go through board rule for us.
And I'll try to keep it brief, because I know a lot of this really is going to be repetitious for you, but I will also say that as we were having all the theory of action conversation, we really started to dive deep into what is the purpose and what is the intention of each of the performance indicators, or what are we trying to get at, and also potentially sort of what are the considerations for use with some of those indicators. And so, as draft rule says, the state board shall have the 4 performance indicators of student academic achievement, student longitudinal academic growth, student academic growth to standard, which we're going to spend some time talking about in the next couple of months, and then post-secondary and workforce readiness. We all know where those are, but it's really actually in the calculation methodology that the board has quite a bit of flexibility. And so we did feel it was important, as we're getting ready to sort of go back through the draft rule, that you guys look at what exactly is laid out and how the calculations are created. So for academic achievement, it shall be based on students' academic performance relative to the grade level state standards as measured by performance on the statewide assessments, while ensuring that student privacy is protected. And then really the intent of this academic achievement measure is it's the annual measure of student academic outcomes within a school or district. Nobody's surprised by any of that. And how we've implemented it right now has just been, our mean scale score results on the annual state assessment, and we do offer
high-performing schools an award program, for the top 8% of achievement across the state. And one of the challenges that we do see, and we've heard from the field over the past couple of months in gaining feedback, is that the achievement is not particularly sensitive to year-to-year changes in school practices, and largely that's because aggregated achievement results are very consistent across years, and it's also highly related to demographic outcomes. And so, those are just things to keep in mind when we start having the weighting conversation. And then the next indicator is academic growth. And so the rule says it shall be based on students' academic progress on statewide assessments across school years and relative to students with similar assessment score histories, and then aggregated at the school district and institute level. And really the intent of the growth indicator is that it reflects student learning made within the past year while that student has been enrolled in your school, and that it's sensitive to year-to-year changes in practice, and it measures sort of the impact that the school or district is having on your student performance in that year.
Marie, could
mhm.
I ask you to
Yep.
very specifically explain an example of that first one? Relative to students with similar assessment score histories aggregated at the public, blah, 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 blah.
So the way the growth model works is it looks at an individual child, and say this year I scored a 675, and last year I scored a 650. And so what it does is it looks at all the other kids who previously had the same score, so everyone who scored a 650 last year, and says, did I do a better job than that academic peer group?
Regardless of demographic.
Regardless of demographic.
Okay, that's what I
It does not care about anything other than your achievement outcomes being the same across the years.
Thank you.
And then we really just roll like all those student level results up at the school and district level. And one of the big advantages of our growth indicator is the fact that it is not correlated with demographics of students, and it's not correlated. It's correlated very low at the school or district level when you aggregate together. You guys don't care about that. Never mind.
Oh, we do.
Do you have a question, Steve?
Steve?
Okay.
You have a question?
No.
Okay.
Anybody else?
Before I move on. And we, for implementation, median growth percentiles is how we report that. And we do also have a set of awards that recognize schools or districts that are getting high growth. So there's some parity between the achievement and the growth awards in ensuring that there's recognition for high performance. And so some of the observations and some of the criticisms of the growth calculations is that it is calculated independently each year based upon sort of that observed student population. So inferences about your results across time may not be consistent. So this goes into what it means to be at the 50th percentile each year may not be exactly the same. It just depends on the population of students in a given year. And again, sort of as you talked about, yeah, definitely.
I'm trying to understand can it also be related to the difficulty of the assessment year to year?
So in general, as long as students are scoring about the same relative to one another. So it doesn't actually matter if I get a 650 or a 675, as long as Ashley consistently scores above me. And so for most of the assessments that we have gone through over the past couple of years, sort of students' relative ranking to one another has stayed pretty consistent. So even if the assessment, like we went from CSAP to CMAS, the whole assessment got more difficult, but pretty much the entire student population sort of just shifted in time with that. So we didn't see a lot of students who previously had been low performing suddenly jumping up and appearing to be high performing. It was kind of that everyone just looked like they weren't as high performing as they previously had been.
Because when we were looking at proficiency previously, before 163, there was the thought that some years, some of the assessments really were more difficult because across the board.
We did see, and sorry for speaking for assessment, we had seen under the old CSEP assessments that there was an A and a B form. So it's like one form of the test was given on even years, one form was given on odd years, and we did see over time that the difficulty of those forms deviated a little bit.
So we're right.
But the advantage of the growth model, again, is the fact that even though sort of the difficulty of those test forms got a little bit off, students' relative rankings stayed pretty much the same. And so the growth model was able to provide meaningful information about student progress, even between those two slightly discrepant test difficulties.
Trying to understand this more deeply.
That's good.
It's supposed to be a deep dive.
Schools identified for growth awards. I can't understand that one. So I've got 3 schools, and they're all high performing, but the award is given for the one that grew the most to get up to that level.
So and forgive me, this is probably a phrasing issue. So it's actually that schools are getting recognized that have high growth, and that's a separate set of awards. So it's not that they're performing on the frameworks necessarily
okay.
that well.
I
It's
get
it's
it.
just that they're getting an award for their growth.
I see.
This is good feedback for how I should restructure my slides.
I thought that we had 2 different things going on there, but it's one.
Yes. And we'll make sure that we clarify that because
Thank you.
we don't want that confusion. And so the new indicator that we are, required to add based upon statute shall be based on students' academic growth to standards compared to incremental targets towards meeting for students who are not yet meeting expectations and maintaining or increasing performance for students who are already meeting grade level or expectations or exceeding grade level expectations. So for the growth to standard indicator, you sort of have to have what happens if you need to catch up, you need to get to proficiency versus if you are already at proficiency, you just need to maintain or keep up proficiency. And so, the intent of this indicator really is to bridge the gap between achievement and growth metrics. And it shows, systems that are meeting state expectations are doing a better job of increasing average student growth towards expectations. And so what you're really looking for is that below benchmark students, so below proficient students will be moving up, and then students who are at or above benchmark will be staying there. They'll be maintaining that same high level of performance over time and giving credit for both of those trajectories. Does that make sense?
Do you have something, Jane?
Yeah, I'm trying to decide right now whether I'm frustrated by that or not.
Okay.
The whole idea of maintaining grade level proficiency. Then what? It's as long as districts and schools and everybody, parents and kids alike, have a clear understanding of what that means and that they haven't lost sense of, the question, is maintenance enough?
Adequate.
Mm-hmm.
Is it adequate? Yep.
Yeah.
That's-
And
Average
if
is
there's a way we
average.
can, as we live together, we'll probably get that point across. It's just, it's a
Well,
reality and it just frustrates me.
It's the criticism of the accountability system.
Yeah.
In that it doesn't have the same level of push.
But average is average.
I'm not talking
I don't
about
care, you look.
Yeah,
average. I'm not average.
it all goes back
Average is
in my
usually-
head, and thank you for indulging me. It all goes back to what are the needs? The need that if we talk all needs are being met or we're trying to do that,
And I think that
What is
when we
that?
talk about the growth to standard metric in more detail, we'll have the opportunity to dig a little bit deeper into sort of your concerns around.
that's why I'm excited about this.
Oh, good. I know. Sorry. We just wanted to make sure that we grounded everyone in rulemaking before we bring in sort of the complicated bugaboo that winds up being growth to standard. Yeah. Okay, so and with the growth to standard, so what we really are looking at currently is sort of, looking at the proportion of students in a district or school that are on track to attain or maintain the target performance level. And as I said, again, we're going to jump into how some of that works out and some of the recommendations that we've received thus far from our technical advisory panel towards the end of the session, so I'm not going to go into more detail about that. But just note that one of the difficulties that we've encountered is creating attainable targets for students who are below benchmark while also attaining ambitious targets for students who are at or above benchmark. Doing both of those things in a single metric is very difficult. And again, we're going to get into more of the details around that. And so then for post-secondary and workforce readiness, I'm not going to read through the whole statute right now. Just know that there have been several additional post-secondary workforce readiness measures that have been passed through statute that we will be adding over the next couple of years. And so we're going to be revisiting this one probably fairly frequently as these new data points come online.
Has the addition of those diluted the importance of graduation? I mean, I keep worrying about it as we add and add and add and add. All of a sudden, we kind of forget. Some of these are graduation, part of graduation guidelines, but they're not the only ones. And what we really want to know is, are they graduating or moving on to higher education?
And I think how we choose to operationalize these new indicators and how we choose to incorporate them into the frameworks, hopefully in 2020, is when we will get to decide if it dilutes or how much.
So the legislation doesn't set that.
Mm-mm.
We set that.
Yes, the state board
Okay.
still has autonomy over the weightings of the sub-indicators within that
helps,
indicator.
I think.
And so I would anticipate that we'll probably spend a lot of time chatting with you guys then and figuring out what balance you would be comfortable with that reflects sort of your values for Colorado and the importance of
Rebecca, did you have
PWR.
something?
I just wanted to know why AP course completion at the end here, not English language math? Is that because that's covered in others? Okay, got it. I
Yep.
thought so, but I just wanted to make sure I was understanding correctly.
Yes, the graduation guidelines demonstration options includes AP for English language arts and math, and so then this additional bill sort of was like, and everything outside of that. So that's what that's intended to convey. And so, you know, with all of these PWR measures, really what we're trying to do is describe systems that are effective at readying and, as I said, launching their students into post-secondary success, because some of these are, you know, matriculation rate is after you have left the high school. So it's really looking at sort of the you know, end product of our entire educational system and whether students are going on to be successful. And some of the challenges with that is that the locally determined graduation requirements may not be consistent across districts and schools.
Are not consistent.
Are not.
Let's be real.
And we also have, for some of those sort of post-graduation outcomes, that schools are not able to directly influence what happens after the students have left their high schools. So how we choose to you know, incorporate those is going to be really important. And then again, some measures are related to demographic composition of the schools, which is always, you know, just something to be kept in consideration. And so then I'm going to pass that back to Ashley or Katie.
So if we had integration, then we wouldn't have, you know,
It would
that
help.
big, that big problem.
Oh, I know what this is, yeah. I think you're passing it back to me. They just wanted to keep me on my toes.
I feel like you're included.
I wanted to feel involved. So this is, you know, I do think it's important, as we've been discussing and debating all these changes, thinking about like how each of the indicators are used and at what level of the system and for what purpose. So, you know, schools and districts use these indicators in maybe a different way than our state uses them, right? So again, they use it for their planning processes, they use it for some of their root cause analysis, and prioritized areas of focus. So it gives them a clue as to, you know, where they need to dive deeper into their local data and such. And then we use it, you know, more at that 35,000 foot view level, kind of as the dipstick to test, you know, and see who are we identifying and who do we need to support? If we go back to the declaration of intent, you know, how do we identify folks that we need to support and find resources for? So I think that was what I was supposed to say, something along those lines.
How's it working out?
It's going to,
Well
it's
done.
been,
Well done.
just like Jennifer Mello, it's been a long week.
Steve?
As I recall, going back to some of the original creations, or at least what I characterize as the modern accountability system in the late 90s, one of the fundamental objectives was to provide information to parents so they could evaluate and compare one school's outcome with another school's outcome.
Yeah.
And I really thought that's what this department was charged
Yeah.
with doing, perhaps more than anything else, at least based on intent. That parent, we should, and I don't know we've ever been terribly successful, but we should be able to publish and easily inform parents that school A is better than school B, and if you can opt into school B, school A, you should do that. I don't know, it appears to me we're getting a little bit away from that fundamental objective, and I would think we need to at least ensure that our rating system can convey that information to parents, which is by and large an outcome, it really is strictly an outcome measure. It's not a growth measure, it's at the end of the day, which school is performing better. Now, it may be also helpful for a parent to know that some schools produce better growth than others. But you've got to get to a point where, maybe schools are interested in graduation rates, or maybe parents are. But my guess is they're a lot more interested in overall quality, and they presume graduation rates will follow that and some of these other things.
Yeah.
So in anything we do, I want to make sure at the end of the day, we have that
Yep.
easy measure, which provides, and whether it's fair based on all the inputs. I'm not too interested in fair. Just so that it informs people of where the best opportunities to achieve a quality education are.
Depends on what they
Yeah.
want, Steve, that,
Well,
you have a certain measure for yourself of what you would want for your kids. It is not universal. It's important to provide the information where there's similar, where are they different. But to suggest that one is better than another, boy, you're just getting yourself, you are setting a statewide criteria that says this is better than that.
Well, I think
Growth may be a whole lot more important to some parents.
I think I will challenge that. I mean, it is a statement that simply says, and it is the ultimate of cover-up statement. It's simply a statement that says results don't matter. Sooner or later, kids need to, we need to know that they've learned something, and that, and it's easy to learn to measure what they've learned vis-a-vis kids in other schools. I'm not trying to put any value judgment on it, but if outcomes don't matter, and there are probably parents who are concerned about something else, well, good for them. I don't think their children, they may be doing their children a disservice, they may not. But I think most parents want quality outcomes. And the quality outcome is, can they read, write? Do they perform well enough to get into a good college? Are they able to get into a trade school? Are they well enough educated to get a license in a professional trade? Those are the outcomes I think they're looking for. And I just don't, to say that, well, all potential measures are of equal value is
I didn't say that.
absolutely,
I didn't say that.
it's like saying all cultures are of equal value. They're not. Some are better than others.
But that's for the parents to decide. By putting all the information out there and making it available, then a person can
If you
decide.
blend the information, you put out no information.
Right. I agree.
Fairness
I agree.
is very important.
Jane had her,
I guess I need clarity. Are you saying that there is no way for parents to see what results are? I mean, I'm just thinking, we do have, if
I don't want to end up there, I think, is the
no,
answer.
we do have, what I'm saying is, the performance framework reports themselves give, in my definition, they give the basic scores, you know, or ratings or rankings. We've also got what's online, what we have through the
Schoolview.
Schoolview, and all the different parts of it. And I'm not totally up to speed this minute, but if continuing work is being done on the dashboard components, and you know we do that. I'm just curious, Steve, if you're saying there is no way at all that a parent can't find out info where they can compare stuff, and they can look at growth, and they can look at achievement, and they can make a decision perhaps that way, or the matriculation indicator for post-secondary, that does have some information. You know, we may not be at the perfect list of things yet, but
I think the question is, Jane,
do people know about it is
if we're,
also big,
if we're
but how
doing
do
such
they
a
use
good
it?
job at it here, why are there private organizations who have to go through our data, synthesize it, and make it available in a more useful form? Why is that?
I mean, you know,
why is that required?
That's their choice to do it.
Well,
That's
they
it.
wouldn't do it.
It's available data, they choose to
They
do
wouldn't
that.
do it if the way we put the data out was so useful that it could be accessed and used by parents in the ordinary scheme of things.
They would if they could make a buck doing so.
That's
Well,
right,
most of
and
these are
that's why we have-
nonprofits.
Well,
he's right,
nonprofit
they're
is
not-
profit.
They've been around long enough, and they have,
No.
I
I-
assume,
I
some
will just-
audience.
May I
don't know.
speak on that, because I think, I mean, when you say it doesn't matter that it's not fair, I am deeply saddened by what you're saying, because you're saying that what New York is trying to do right now, and that is take 25% of any middle school and have that available for special ed kids, for kids that are minority and such, because we know that integration matters and fairness matters, and we know that equal opportunity matters and equity matters, and that's the basis of our values, which are democratic, and that's fairness. You cannot say that we are not about fairness. Now, this may be, you know, a way of trying to give boards to look at fairness. I know some school districts are not fair. I know they're not. But you're kind of going into a dark side of that I just don't think we need to go into.
I think parents need to be able to, need to know what the result is, not what the excuse as to why one result is worse than another. Because I think your definition of fairness is we count the excuses. I'm not interested in the excuses
We're
when
talking
we're
about
putting out data.
pocketbooks, we're talking about pocketbooks, we're talking about,
Doesn't
you know,
matter.
the color of people's skins. It matters.
Doesn't matter.
It matters.
Doesn't matter. The results matter, and
Well,
the people who
We've been
are going to
racist. This
utilize.
country has been racist for so long,
Who has?
this country. And that we have to think about fairness. And I know it's not in 1860, whatever, but here we are,
So to the,
21st century, and we can't talk about fairness.
to
We
the
are talking
overall
about
point.
values, Steve, and that's gonna be really hard. If you just decide who's best based on your values,
No, I'm just saying, who's
You're-
best based on the score?
but that's.
There's a
that's-
test, there's a score.
Yeah.
You don't
but
have to apply any value whatsoever
Yes,
to
you
it.
do.
Parents can do that.
Socioeconomics and test scores, you know, they go hand in hand. They're like this.
So so feedback that we're hearing now is feedback that we did get from stakeholders as well. But one thing I would note is that
You say you did or did not?
we did.
Okay.
One thing I would note though is that when we got into this conversation, we tried to separate or have two separate conversations, one about data reporting and then one about what's in the frameworks, right? So in the frameworks,
What's in, I'm sorry.
What's in what?
one about what is actually included in the frameworks and one about
Okay.
how we report all of the data that we have available to us. in the frameworks we are required to have growth and growth to standard and achievement and all that. So the discussion we want to have today is how those things are weighted, how essentially apply values to those different data points to say this is how we see a full picture of a school system. The other piece, which I think you've probably heard us say multiple times, is that we are working on the data reporting piece because there is an acknowledgement that the frameworks are not built for parents to make decisions on where to send their students, right? It's not, if you're a parent, you're picking up, I have 5-year-old twins and I decided what school they were going to go to this year and I didn't use the frameworks to make that decision, right? Because it's not built for that. So we definitely do have initiatives to get parent-friendly, community-friendly, policymaker-friendly versions of this data, because for some people, you just want to see the results. Some people, you just want to see the growth. Some people, I mean, there are different reasons why you would be looking at this data, which is why what Marie was trying to get at is that there are different reasons for looking at this data. What we have the difficult task of trying to figure out how we pull that all together to have some kind of picture of the health of a system of schools that we can then dig deeper into and figure out kind of where they rank in terms of achievement and growth and things like that.
Steve, just a second, Rebecca. When I read these first 3 pages, which is what was the preamble to 163, it did not say what you just said. So this may be something that you want us to achieve, but I'm not sure that it's 163.
No, I think the things I'm talking about precede 163.
And that may be, and it's a worthwhile discussion.
And those were the
but-
very original discussions around accountability.
Right.
Well, I actually-
Was to provide a way for parents
Right.
to decide.
But that's not 163. I mean, there's nothing in here that you just described, that's the purpose of what we were doing here.
Is there anything in there that prohibits us from providing parents the
Yes.
appropriate
Yes,
information?
because if we try to use the same instrument to do 100 different things, to add what you want to this, we just convolute it. Let's just see if we can do the best job we can with 163.
Well, just to clarify, sorry.
Go ahead, Kate.
There is a bullet in the legislative declaration around providing data that are recognized by educators, parents, students, higher education community, business community, and other stakeholders that are fair, balanced, objective, all those things around the accountability purposes. So there is a mention of that in the declaration. And I will just reiterate Ashley's point. It is actually what you said, Mr. Durham, is right. We are trying to get more user-friendly entrances into this data. That's a whole other sort of initiative that we're doing. And it takes some time and dollars and such to make it be really, on the website, clickable, easy to those sorts of things. But that is a part of the bigger picture that we're working on, and so we hear that, and it's absolutely a part of our process.
But let's talk for a minute about the issue we really have not discussed to this point, which is we have an accountability system which produces an outcome that says 90% plus of the schools are performing at an acceptable level. Everybody agree with that?
Actually, I think it's around 65%
Performance, yeah.
in performance category.
Performance and above?
Is it performance?
It's more than that.
So around
Can't be
65 in
above
performance, and then if you add improvement, it's 85,
Yeah.
right? 85.
And those aren't subject to any sanctions or reviews. So those, if you look at what we do about those are okay because we're not taking any special action. So you put that information together with the fact that only 40% of kids read at grade level, and somewhere there's a mismatch. And so the question is, are we going to let parents continue to presume that their school, which is in either performance or improvement, but not getting any special attention from policymakers, that's okay? Is when you know that the average school, if you just take the average school, the 50th percentile, if you presume that the kids who couldn't read at grade level were equally distributed, you would have 6 out of 10 kids in that school that couldn't read at grade level. And that's a whole different discussion as we've
Right.
had as to what,
Mhm.
you know, how serious a problem is that? But to continue to have a system where parents can say, oh, gee, my school's great. I mean, look, it's just, it needs a little bit of improvement. In fact, it's maybe in the high range of those new improvement. Well, if they delve a little deeper, they're gonna discover there's a dirty little secret hiding there, that they've got a significant number of kids who don't perform at the level that we think, and I don't wanna include me in that we, the majority, which I've not been part of, thinks should be the standard. So that's really the question. Are we really going to inform parents that maybe we have a problem here we need to address, and that they should pay attention to, or are we going to let the education establishment gloss over this problem and say, gee, everything's just great? And one of two things is going to happen as we change these indicators. Either we're going to move to make sure that situation is highlighted, or we're going to continue to gloss it over. And that's why this is as closely watched as it is, because it has a significant effect on people. So the outcome of this makes a difference. And it makes a difference in what I'm specifically talking about, and that is, at the end of the day, are we getting the result we expect? And if the answer to that question is no, then we need indicators, fair or not, that show that that's the case. Now, if we want to go back and revise the standards, I'm always willing to look at that, because I'm not sold on our standard making process. But as long as these are the standards, then we need to recognize that that's going to be the tension here, and that somehow or another, if we're going to solve this problem, we can't do it alone. Parents are going to have to, A, be informed, and B, hopefully care about it.
I just want to take an opportunity to tag on to what Mr. Durham has shared. There's an element that was echoed by a parent that I heard from in Aurora, who indicated that she had gone to every parent-teacher conference and was always told glowing things about her daughter, which I'm sure are true. I've met them both, very, very lovely people, and she was that involved, engaged parent that you want to see. And she basically was told all the way along, there's no problem here, your child is the kind of student we want to see in class. And it wasn't until she matriculated into her freshman year at the university that they realized she was not ready. And so this was shared with me in the context of a need for transparency within a community where many different languages are spoken. And my response was to share that my own school district has been really consistent about sharing standardized test scores with my family that tell me how my child is doing in comparison to their grade level peers within their individual school, across the district, and across the state of Colorado. So in looking at those three comparisons, they can get a feel for, or parents can get a feel for, not just how is my district doing comparatively, how's my child doing, and how's my child's school doing compared to the rest of the district. And that's the kind of data that I know this parent was hoping to make sure is getting across before it's too late, because she kind of got a rosier impression that than was appropriate for her child, given her child's goals going forward. And if they'd had that information, she might have known to advocate differently or make different choices about her daughter's education, and to prepare her better for that freshman year at college experience. So.
Right. Well, I think you guys are bringing up exactly the tension we're moving into. And I will just, I do just want to remind people too, the one thing we hadn't talked about today was just remember that each parent gets their individual student's assessment score, and it shows right on that. So I'm not saying all of what you've said is true too, I'm sure, but I do just want to know they do get a picture of, you know, where their student is scoring on the assessment compared to the state average, compared to all those. So they get that 100% unvarnished truth each year. With the assessment, and there is a little bit of a difference there. I think I was also supposed to say that in this slide, but you guys jogged my memory around there is that individual student assessment and how they're doing is a little different than the system assessment. But I think, you know, Mr. Durham's point is right, which is how do we bring those things, you know, in alignment? And that's hopefully what the growth to standard metric can help us do. So I think with that, we were told very specifically to bring you examples. So we've brought an example in front of you today, and we'll bring you more, but I think we want to go into that, if that's okay.
Quick.
And this example is really focused on the performance indicators. So again, kind of refocusing on how we weight these indicators against each other on the framework. We do actually have some time set aside to talk about the ratings and the distribution there, because we heard that loud and clear last summer as well from board members. And we looked at statute, and there may be some flexibility there for board members too moving forward. So we'll have that discussion as well.
So let's move, did everybody get one of these in front of, we started them around, I think maybe they got hung up along the way somewhere.
Oh,
There
here
we
it
go.
is.
Val has all of them.
Oh, yeah, wow, you know, that's a pig.
There we go.
Well, it's only fair to share.
I know.
So it was a nice segue into this conversation that we're about to have. What I'd like to do with
Shoot
you
'em.
guys
Just
is
go
have
ahead.
you take a look at this data. So we have two examples, and this is actual school data. So I want you to look at example number 1, and you can see there's a school A and a school B. You can see that these two schools are very similar in demographic. In their demographics, free and reduced is 13% in one, 19% in another, 15% minority, 37% minority, 2% ELL, 4% ELL, and IEP students of 8.6 and 9.2. You can see that they have different school ratings. One school is rated as improvement, one school is rated performance. What I want to do is just take a minute and ask you these two questions. So based on this data that's presented, which school would you prioritize for support in each example? And then what data did you use to reach your conclusion? So those two questions are on the bottom of this page. Take just a minute and think about that, and then let's come back and have a conversation, because I think this is the crux of a lot of what you guys are talking about right now. So let me give you just a minute, and then let's have some conversation on that. And then if we can kind of time that conversation a little bit so that we can
So we're
keep
just on
moving.
example 1 right now.
Just example 1 right now, and then we'll move quickly to example 2. And what I'd like to do is keep us moving, because we have some really important stuff that we need to get to with the technical advisory panel and the growth to standard. So I'll shut up now.
Example 1, Steve. Just example 1.
Oh, just example. I was working ahead, I'm sorry.
Overachiever.
What's your answer number 1?
Which school would I prioritize for,
Intervention of any kind.
Yeah, so which school would you prioritize for support in each of those examples, but specifically to example 1 right now?
well, probably A,
Because.
if I understand this correctly, that 83 points earned meets, meaning 83, it's not percent, but a larger number of students meet the expectations in school B. So,
Where'd you get 83? You got 60% on A.
oh, I'm sorry, it's growth, yeah.
Your-
So they meet the growth. They're almost even on approaching. Yeah, you'd probably, I'd still say school A.
Val? Do you agree?
No, I'm still looking at it.
And we don't have to do it too formally, it's
Right.
just a,
Yeah.
it's just a
It-
point.
It's a good
Right.
example.
You know,
Right.
just kind of showing how the system elements look different.
Any other thoughts on that? And then I can talk through a little bit too. But I wanted to hear what you guys were thinking first before I talk, so.
Well, I would agree with Steve.
Okay. Is everybody kind of in agreement with that? So what you can see here is we have an example, and so when it comes back to this idea of growth versus achievement. So we have 2 schools, these are actual schools, we pulled data, we went and researched some schools. We pulled some data of what it would look like if we have a school that's approaching in growth, they're approaching in achievement, this is an improvement school, okay? And then we have a school that has a higher growth percentage, so they have more students that are growing, but their academic achievement is very similar to the other schools. So this shows you the difference of how schools are built. So we have schools that are very similar, but we do have different performance within those schools. So it's kind of getting to that idea of how are we weighting growth, achievement with districts. It would also be post-workforce readiness. I just wanted to share that example around that. Yes?
Just a quick question. How, if they're so close in achievement,
Mhm.
why are their school ratings so divergent? I see that we have a much faster rate of growth for School B. Does that
That's it.
explain, that's
Mhm.
it?
60%.
Yep.
That's 60% of an elementary school.
Mhm.
Just to make sure that I'm understanding, are
Mhm.
we looking at a school here where, in School B, where we're absolutely expecting them to, any moment, seriously overtake School A because they're learning at a faster rate of speed? I think of a racetrack, the cars are
Mhm.
going faster.
And I think that's a big part of the conversation. So when we think about growth, so we have very similar demographics within these schools, right?
Actually,
So-
they're a little different. Twice as
They're a
many-
little different, but
Twice as many minority kids, higher,
that's true.
Right.
somewhat, what about 25% higher free and reduced lunch?
Mhm.
Twice as many ELLs, not big numbers, however.
Right,
They're
they're
very
not.
manageable numbers. We know that when it gets above 50% is when
Mhm.
things start getting squirrely.
So
Right.
within, right, so within a system, so if I was a superintendent of a school district, and I was, and I was looking at these two schools side by side, then that gives me an opportunity to stop and go, okay, I need to think through what are the next steps for these schools? What are my schools doing well? What might we need to be thinking about? Now, I'm gonna wanna dig deeper. I'm gonna wanna get into those sub-indicators. I'm gonna wanna go more specifically and see how each one of my demographic groups are performing, right? But what you see here is, yes, that potential of we do have a school that is growing more students. They actually are the school that has a few more students in those more challenging demographic areas. But their students are growing at a faster rate, which is incredibly important. So for that school, they do get credit for showing that their system is actually producing growth with their students. Is their achievement level there yet? No. Is that something that I would want to step back and say, you know what, we need to really think about how do we get better achievement with our students? What are some things that we can change? But we know that we have some really positive things going with growth. Whereas with example one, we know that, you know what, we're just approaching in both of those. We have some other work that we need to do there, right? So just a real quick snapshot, but you can see that's how two schools that are built similarly come out differently within the performance frameworks, okay? So let's move to example two, give you a minute to take a look at that, and then we'll kind of go through this same process real quick.
Yeah.
This can happen,
Yeah.
you know, that's,
This is Denver, isn't it?
happens a lot.
Isn't this Denver?
Yeah, well, Denver
East
puts them
It's
down.
No, but I mean,
this
the
type of
overall-
example,
This kind of an example
they're
is what we
everywhere.
read about is,
Yeah,
because they've had
this
the
is-
highest growth in the state.
This
Their
is
schools have
Denver.
had that.
well,
Well, ELL, that's kind of high.
So what are some things that you're noticing specifically about School A versus School B?
It's flipping the achievement and school rating categories.
Mm-hmm.
That feels counterintuitive, though I know growth matters. It feels counterintuitive to have those so dramatically flipped.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And what do you notice about the
not
makeup
counter-
of the schools?
Yeah, it's not
Yeah.
counterintuitive if you look at Boulder.
Yeah.
Boulder demographics.
Right?
But if
It's,
I
it
were,
is, it's the problem that you see in that community.
but
in a
if
lot
I
of
were a
cases.
parent wanting to know, hey, how's that school doing? I might just look at the school rating and that might really give me a skewed picture. That
yeah.
yeah. That is
Well,
tough.
doesn't the exceed the growth rate tells you a few things.
So it's
Yes.
Exceeding the
Denver?
growth
Is
rate,
this-
that's
is
where
this
the
really-
crux of this is.
This is Boulder?
Because look, and then you tie in the
B is more
demographics.
like- Is it more like?
If you're gonna have an excessive
I think
growth,
Boulder-
excessive meaning good,
Because they
Not
does look
today,
like-
but
too much.
Boulder at certainly
they're gonna
one
start
time
lower.
did
Mhm.
not have a lot of growth.
They will probably
Yeah.
have
Growth was
started
not
lower
the-
anyway.
Well, in those,
So
no child
growth
left
rate is
behind,
going to be
you could have
dramatically,
98 one year and then the
it's gonna be
next year,
dramatic
you
no
could
matter
have been
what.
95 or
And if you've got
90, whatever.
a school with
And you
demographics
would've
where all the
cleaned it up
kids start out
in
high,
this
That's where the growth,
Because you
that's
have
where
to
I
just
think
grow,
growth
grow,
differently.
grow. You at the
It can
91
be,
percentile.
it can only be a tiny amount of growth, but if you're already up there to begin with, in
But the-
total mastery, then it's.
So,
So I think the answer to your question is, because that's a great question, so we think about that growth, so sometimes we're going to assume that because a child comes in lower, they're just automatically going to make greater growth, right? Now remember, when we look at student growth, students are compared to their peers that came in at that same level. So I'm compared to a student that had the same score that I did, and then in the system that I'm in, did I show more growth than that student that was in a different system, right? So that's how we can take a systems look at this and know, because it goes back to your point. If I'm a student that's on grade level, here's my score. Alyssa's another student that was on grade level, right? So we're right here. We both are going to different schools. But in my school, well, it's probably because of me, but I only grew this much. But in Alyssa's school, she grew this much. So from a systems perspective, even though that we're on grade level, still compared to my peer, how did I grow? That's the systems piece that growth really helps. And then we also need to know if we don't have great achievement. So when I look at this second example, which school do you feel like would need more support? And before we move on to that, let me make sure, did I answer that correctly? Okay, all right. Check with my team here and make sure I'm
Well,
right.
A, because they need more help, they only have 56.3% of the points earned in the area of achievement. So,
Mhm.
and they've got a bunch of other challenges.
But
with-
they've got growth, and so the faith you have in growth is that you're gonna get to achievement.
yeah.
Yeah.
You're on the right track.
Is it growth to standard?
Well, and so
Yeah,
that's the
right.
great, that's a great next,
Right.
so that's the segue into where we're going, because that's a great question. How does that play into that? Now, what I would tell you from, again, from a perspective, if I'm looking at a school that has high achievement, but it's not showing great growth, if I have that student that's on grade level, I want to ensure that my student makes that year's growth, right? So if I've got a fourth grader, I want to make sure that they're in a system that's going to make it to fifth grade and be on grade level. I don't want them to fall back. I don't want them to not be successful. So I would not be as concerned about academic achievement in School B because they have very solid achievement, but I would be very concerned about the growth that my students are making. Are we resting on our laurels is the question that I would ask.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know whether they are or not. I would need to know a lot more information, but just on a very surface level, those are some things that we would want to think about. That conversation that you guys just had was a masterful conversation to this component. So let's stop there and let's move on because I need to keep us rolling here. So the next few minutes, what we want to talk about is thinking about revisiting the frameworks and the weightings conversation. Yes. Oh, yes, thank you. I can't do these all at once.
Well, may I
Sure,
ask a question?
absolutely.
I mean, I know that one of the things with No Child Left Behind, that was kind of a big issue with the growth. Even schools that were, say, at a 95%, let's say they scored at a 95%. The following year, they scored at a 93.5, but yet, you know, they didn't. When you went down, and even though you're at a 95 percentile above overall, but if you didn't grow, you were.
Growth
It
was
didn't help.
growth was a different measure back
We
then.
can talk offline about that.
That's,
yeah.
it's, yeah, it's a little, yeah, okay.
It was
well,
different.
I know, I'm bringing up something about the
Okay,
past.
let's move because
Thank you.
Steve has to catch a plane, so we need to.
All right, so let's then revisit the framework around the weighting conversations, and that's the conversation that started back in August, right? I was when I very first got here, and it seems like I've been immersed in this conversation a great deal since then, so let's continue it on. But I think we need to ground ourselves in board rules, so what are some opportunities that the board has at this point in time? And then the other part that I do want to share, the feedback that we got resoundingly from the field, and I know you guys have heard that, it's been stated several times already, was around the idea that growth matters. In Colorado, our superintendents and our organizations that are involved in education value growth. It might not be 100%, but overwhelmingly what I heard out there and what I hear from my peers, we value that. We also value academic achievement. That's important. Achievement is important. So how do we balance that out? Thank goodness that's your role. So we'll get you into that and let you have some conversations around that. So a couple of things that I just want to come back and make sure that we ground ourselves in. The rule states that when evaluating attainment of the performance indicators, the department shall place the greatest emphasis on student longitudinal academic growth and post-secondary workforce readiness. That was in, since 2010, that has been the rule that we've been focused on, okay? So at this point in time, at the elementary and middle school levels, 60% of points are attributed to growth, 40% are attributed to achievement. At the high school level, 30% is achievement, 30% is post-workforce readiness, and 40% is growth. So that's currently where we are in the process. All right, so then what has happened is, because of the advent of 1355, we know that we have to bring back the growth to standard, needs to be added back into the frameworks. So the Technical Advisory Panel, which is a group that's convened by the commissioner, this is a group of professionals and experts from around the state and the nation that work on longitudinal measurement for academic growth and accountability purposes. So that group has been working closely with us for the last 5 or 6 months, really going through this conversation. They're at a point where they're ready to make a recommendation. And so what I'd like to do is, we do have a list, and that was one of the things that we had been asked for, a list of who is on this panel. So we have that list, and then a description of the group of the folks that are on that list, and then we also have their recommendation that we would like to share with you. So what I'd like to do is give you some time to look at that recommendation, read through that recommendation, and then we'll come back after that, and we'll hand it back to Katie to carry this conversation further. But so we'll get that to you.
And it's a double-sided handout, and it is TAP's recommendation on growth, on the weighting of growth and achievement on the frameworks. So after you have maybe 2 or 3, maybe 5 minutes to read through that, we'll pause again and have a conversation. So now that we've gone through the example, kind of seeing the recommendation from TAP, just kind of get a sense of where board members are in terms of that weighting, so that can drive our work and what types of models we bring back.
So that will allow you, based on whatever recommendation you might
Well, just
consider.
read.
That gives you an opportunity then to actually put those to data that we have, so we get a sense for what that looks like,
Yeah.
Steve. So that then we see whether it
Let us
suggests.
read, would you please?
Sorry to be stopping you.
Does anybody need any more time? No.
Maybe a little bit.
Okay.
I'm trying to think about it while I read it.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot to think
It's
about.
hard. It is complicated, and just so you know, we're introducing this recommendation to you. We're gonna be scheduling. We know you're gonna need time to digest this. We're gonna give you some additional material to leave with today, and then we'll schedule meetings with you to help you understand the technical part of it. So this is kind of introducing it to you. It'll be a step-by-step process, so you don't have to get it all right this minute. This is the workshop, right? So we're introducing.
All we're talking about is what we have. We're not.
Well, part of what we need is we need some guidance from you guys on the weightings so that we can then go back, run some models, bring them back to start that conversation around different scenarios that could happen.
This recommendation is only for number 1, so I don't even know what the
Yes.
recommendation is for 2 and 3.
Yes.
How can I give you guidance?
So
I'm confused.
what we're asking for now is guidance on the conversation that we started around the growth that we currently have in our frameworks, which is that normative growth based on the growth model versus achievement, because that's a big conversation we've been having over the past couple of months. So want to get a little direction there. The next section of this presentation is getting deep into growth to standard. So we'll talk about what the TAP's recommendation is there, and their recommendation we're going to share today is on the methodology for growth to standard, not on its inclusion in the frameworks. That's kind of the
So
next step
I
down the
want to be
road.
done with 3. And
Can
I
I
can't,
ask-
I can't answer 1 until I can, I mean, I don't,
Mm-hmm.
me personally, I don't want just one model.
Right.
I would feel a whole lot better if you had, if this, then this is what it looks like.
Uh-huh.
If this, then that's what it looks like.
Mhm.
Not, do I agree or don't I agree? Because I can't.
Okay.
Can I ask a question on growth? Is, when you, is it possible, if you know where student A started and where they ended, and you can calculate that growth within a year's period, is it possible if you project that same rate of increase to know when they would reach proficiency? Can you attach a time to that in terms of years, semesters, months? Because I think, you know, it's a lot easier to value growth if you can predict with certainty that there is an outcome, and that outcome is X, and there's a successful outcome, and that's X months away or X years away. And if you can't, and then I think you have to continue to, you know, if the second 6-month or year period doesn't yield the same growth, then that probably needs to be a negative count against if you're using a growth to standard. Because the idea is everybody's gonna read at grade level. If that's the idea, does that happen at the end of 4th grade, at the end of 5th grade, at the end of 6th grade, 7th grade, never? And I think that's what we're, at least I would feel a lot more comfortable with the growth model if I knew it really meant proficiency at the end. If it doesn't mean proficiency in some reasonable amount of time, then I'm not inclined to weight it very much.
Depends on the effectiveness of the teacher as well as,
Well, there are all kinds of variables.
there's so many variables that I
And-
don't see.
And
how
home and-
anybody could answer
So
your question.
we can definitely jump into the growth to standard conversation, because we're going to be talking about that specifically. But quickly
Is that
before
the
we
way you measure it, or how do you measure growth to standard? Is it time, and is it on a linear basis, time basis?
the amount, yes, so that's one of the questions the TAP was trying to answer, is how much time, so looking at how our students have performed historically, how much time, if a student is making this much growth,
Right.
how many years would it take for them to get to
Right,
this
that's
next point?
And so that is what you're looking, okay.
Yeah.
That's what we're
That's what
doing.
we're looking at.
That's very helpful.
That's what we're trying,
So we're definitely getting in there. But then before we move there, and maybe just for 1 minute, just to follow up on a bunch of the conversations we've had today around what we're looking for in the overall ratings. So it's been mentioned, you know, we can't have this conversation until we have all the pieces together, and then we'll look at the models and say, you know, see what happens. Is there any, and this is probably a hard question, but is there any direction from the board on what you're looking to see happen? Yes.
I'm, just as Dr. Schroeder shared, I'm feeling like, if I could see examples, I wanna make sure that whatever seems like an intuitive suggestion does not then have the kind of unintended consequence
Yeah.
that right now, oh, you don't wanna do that, let me share why.
Yeah.
Cause I want it to be consistent with, are we identifying and helping the kids who need it the most,
Right.
and the ones in the middle as well, of course.
Right.
But are we identifying and targeting our aid where it's gonna be the most effective in helping the most kids get the most progress? And, so like, for example, at the bottom of the front page, on this, handout, it seems intuitive to adjust the expectations of growth, so that they're more modest as you start bumping up against the ceiling of the expectations. So if you're extremely high performing, we shouldn't be expecting you to grow as fast as one who needs to make up more ground, maybe? But
Depends how we
Not
define
necessarily.
growth.
but I would wanna see examples of what does tweaking it look like?
Yeah.
So that, I almost would
Yeah.
like a menu of choices, like if you tweaked it thusly, here's what you're doing, and
Yeah.
here's who you're identifying for help, and here's what this is coming out as in terms of school ratings.
Yep.
Could I ask one other, just one basic question? When you talk about including growth to standard, are you talking about essentially, and I'm looking at the pie charts, are you talking about reducing growth's percentage here and putting in another color, it's another color of the rainbow here, which is growth to standard, which is somehow different than growth? Is that where we're headed? So that we would have, in elementary, we would have 3 majors. We would have achievement, growth, and growth to standard.
Correct.
Yes.
And we have
to Okay. figure
out the weight.
Right, and then so then it's how you divide the pie.
Right.
Exactly.
So is
You
it
got
more
it.
helpful to?
Nothing to this.
So then, maybe direction from you all, is it more helpful to jump into the growth standard conversation now, or is it, do you want to stay on the higher level pie discussion?
I'm almost afraid to discuss it without knowing how tweaks
Yeah.
could actually come out in terms of the impact it has on how we allocate the most help as intelligently and effectively and compassionately as possible to the kids who need it the most. And I feel like examples would help me.
Okay.
Maybe there's a balance, I'm sorry, Joyce. Did you want?
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Jane.
Are there some general concept things, though, that would be helpful to have in mind as we're moving through when we have examples? Because we're all different, obviously.
Yeah, we're in all different
Um,
places. And
right.
that's the-
I have a
Philosophically,
kind
we're
of
in
an
different
appetite
places.
for just get the big picture,
Yeah.
and then, but,
Some
you know,
of us
I
don't think
appreciate
that way.
everybody's needs.
Some of us can't think that way. I can't think way up here and make some kind of a decision based on some
Well,
idea,
I just think
because
some
that's where we are right
pictures
now
of-
and we're not happy, right? We're sitting right now
I know.
on what we have been doing.
So
And
she
we're
said,
s-
"Do not have-"
We are feeling that there's data that's being lost by virtue of the,
But I think we had to get you to the point that Steve just got to, which is like here's the pie, and here's how those things impact the other. And the reason we couldn't bring you models today yet is because we just got sort of the methodology for that really challenging growth to standard metric that took them 18 meetings, or something. 8, sorry. Okay.
What's the nickel version of the growth to standards? I mean, I don't know how much, if we knew what the nickel version was.
Yeah.
Spend a lot of time and you're only gonna
Yeah.
pay a nickel?
Well, no,
We've
I want to
handout.
pay a lot more, I just want to pay a nickel now.
Right, okay.
So we can
All
jump
right,
into
good.
that.
yeah,
Perfect.
let's go to that.
So growth to standard it describes student growth towards meeting grade level expectations as defined by the underlying assessment. So for example, if we're talking about in grades 3 through 8, we have the CMAS assessment. So we're saying how much growth would a 3rd grader need to show to be on track to reaching the next performance level within a certain amount of time. So that's the overall question the TAP was trying to figure out.
Ashley, just slow it down a little bit, okay?
Yes, I know, I'm a
Thank
fast
you.
talker. Thank you. So CDE staff has worked with the TAP over the past year to develop this metric. And we will be able to evaluate impact data and have models prior to rulemaking sessions. And so over the next 2.5 months, we'll have one-on-one sessions with board members. We'll also be coming to your board meetings with some of this impact data. We're sharing this impact data with districts and schools as well. And another thing to note is that the TAP did analyze historical student growth data to ensure that the student level goals are ambitious yet attainable. And so this is a kind of reiteration of adequate growth, which we had in the frameworks previously. And a lot of feedback that we heard from adequate growth was that as you get to the higher grades,
Time's run out.
yes, it was a meaningless metric because we're saying you have to show growth that we've never seen before, right, in order to meet this metric. So we're trying to so the TAP did really try to spend a lot of time thinking through how we can make it a meaningful metric at all grade levels, at the student level, school level, and district level. And so the 4 main questions that the TAP did actually come up with a recommendation for are here on the slide, and so we'll talk through this really quickly before we get into
You
what
can
they're
slow it down.
recommending.
You don't have to go real quick.
Yeah.
Well,
So the 4 areas
I'm
the
sorry,
TAP
we were
did
rushing
focus
to get
on.
by 4.
This first one is what targets? And so the first question was, should we be expecting all students who are coming in below grade level to get to grade level? Is that everybody's target? Or should we be having students have interim targets to get to grade level, right? Just based on what we see students historically doing. That's how we see growth typically. The second question was, how long should students have to achieve the targets? So once we decide where students are shooting for, how long do they have to get there to say that they're on track or off track? The third question is, how does the target update over time? So does the target reset every year based on what the student's current academic achievement is? Or is it something where you come in at 3rd grade and say you're at level 3 and we want you to get to level 4, then you're held to that standard from 3rd grade through 8th grade. Do you get there in that whole time and your trajectory kind of stays the same, or is that trajectory changed based on your performance every single year? And then the 4th question was, how do we report it? And so do we report students that are below proficient, which we call catch-up students who are trying to catch up to proficiency, and above proficient or the keep-up students separately? Do we report them combined? And then we are going to be having further conversations with TAP about coming up with a recommendation for how it's actually included in the frameworks and the weighting. So you'll have a similar kind of handout from TAP around this is what we think growth to standards should look like in the frameworks.
Is it okay to jump in?
Yeah.
Can you use your mic? Sorry.
Oh, thank you. Yes. I know that this is my view that I'm hoping we'll reach the maximum number of catch-up students without underserving the keep-up students. But I'm tempted to say that we have to put weight on reporting the catch-up students separately because it's so important to get them where they need to be, but I don't speak for anybody else, obviously. But am I right that that might help us get to a more efficient identification of the students who need the most help? It seems like a really different thing, the keep-up student and the catch-up student. So it seems intuitive that you'd report them separately. Maybe I need a tutorial on why we wouldn't.
No, that's a great point, and those are the conversations we're having now. And just to note that districts will always receive their individual student level data, so they'll see it separately. But when we talk about how it gets rolled up into the frameworks, there are considerations there. So what you brought up is a great one. One thing we've thought about is just minimum N size, right? So when you're further separating students, you get into smaller buckets, and so in our efforts to be able to report on as many students as possible, that's one reason why we would consider reporting them together, but that's a trade-off. So we have to, those are the conversations we're having now.
Okay, I
Yeah.
see your point.
But have we created an impossible task for our data people to analyze? So is it doable?
That's
It's
Marie.
doable.
Ask Marie, because she's our data people.
We can do that, yeah.
Data guy.
Well, Maria, there's a difference between doable and it's, no more complicated than a trip to Mars, so. Is it something that's practical? I mean, that's a better question.
So I think that it is pretty complicated, particularly to come up with a single metric that describes everyone and makes ambitious and yet attainable targets. I think that's the reason that it has taken us this 8 meetings in almost a year now to come to the point of having recommendations. And I do think that there are some trade-offs where to have one sort of set of outcomes, you're sort of having to give up the option for another set of outcomes or possibilities. And so I think that I really want to spend a little more time sort of walking you through like how that growth to standard methodology was developed and why the decisions were made as they were, because I do think that on the surface some of them might not seem quite so palatable, but then when you really dig into like what the impact would have been if you had made some of the other choices, and then you're like, oh, that's why we didn't do that. And so I know like we have an abbreviated version, and I will acknowledge that it's me, and I'm not good at writing short things, so Ashley condensed this down from my long-winded explanation. But I do think that this sort of gives you a high-level overview of the conversations that were had during those TAP meetings and why the decisions and the recommendations that have been made, where those really had come from and what the end result looks like. And we did take the TAP through the process of looking at, you know, if for individual students, this is how it would function, this is how metric would function for different kinds of students, this is how it would roll up at the school level, at the district level. And only at the last meeting last week, we started talking about impact data in terms of this is how it would impact your ratings. Like, I mean, again, it took us months to get to that place. And at the last meeting, you know, the TAP, they also came back and were like, we would like more impact data. We would like to see more scenarios and under some different sort of considerations, and before we can provide a recommendation.
So you get a student who comes into your school in 3rd grade,
Mm-hmm.
doesn't speak English very well, and is 2 years behind.
Yep.
And that's actually a pretty easy one compared to kids that are even further behind.
Yes.
We've had this expectation that magically we're gonna catch that kidlet up in a very short period of time.
We did in the past.
And is that the high but achievable goal? Or do we recognize something different? And on what basis do we do that? And these end up being value judgments that we make in this measure.
And particularly when we're looking at the historical data and seeing what is possible. Because one of the biggest things that we heard from our TAP, and based upon what we had previously, was that having a measure that no school can attain, which honestly saying that 100% of our students are on track to catch up, our current data does not support that as being a realistic outcome. That makes it so that the schools and districts, since they don't find that outcome to be attainable, they don't bother trying. They say, well, it's a failed cause, so let's just not even try. So we really were trying to balance out creating a metric that, yes, was ambitious in the fact that like it's something that students are not currently doing, but it wasn't so ambitious that no one could ever do it. So it really was trying to you know, encourage schools to move in the right direction, but also making it so that some of them can still look successful. And that the fact that they're doing a really difficult job. And as a state, we are definitely not where we want to be, but progress towards improvement is better than just punishing everyone.
But can I ask just one quick question? If, in looking at this, I mean, I would make, I'd want to know the impact, but I would suggest that some of the changes should be made is, you know, at the high school level, I would increase the measure or the percentage of achievement significantly, so that it starts to weigh significantly more than the other two factors, growth, and particularly growth, because, you know, if you're not getting it by about 11th grade, now your growth to grade 12 is not terribly relevant. So I would make some of those changes, and I think what the chair has indicated is that what's the impact if we were to just do that? If we were to say growth's going to be 50%, and we're going to reduce the other two 10% each, what would the impact of that be? And then in introducing growth to standard, if we're not sure of the impact of that, or we suspect the impact of that measure, if we were to just arbitrarily conclude that every student will reach grade level in 3 years. Let's be arbitrary and say that's the objective, knowing that that objective is not achievable for a variety of reasons, but we could then, and let's say we weighted that initially rather small at 10% or some relatively small number, and so we could see the impact and see how it worked through over time, and we could weight it in a way that if that's the objective, but we would consider it a good score if you got 60% or 50%, pick a number that we would rate that as exceeds expectations, let's say. Even though the objective is 100, 60% exceeds expectations. And I'm being completely arbitrary, but and we rolled that in a 10% the first year, see what the impact is, 15%. I mean, we could increase. We don't have to do this on a static basis, and it would give us a chance then to evaluate the effect of our changes, not only on performance but on attitude of those who are responsible for implementing it. And I think that's the information that would be helpful to me if you ran a few models and say, the very simple ones, if we increased achievement to 50% at the high school level, what would be the impact on the rankings of the high schools? And I think that's something I'd like to move in that direction. So, and if you add growth to standard at the high school level, I suspect it's harder to measure, but so maybe it isn't much. And you tweak the others, but ultimately we need to get to how many students are we turning out that meet expectations, and do those things correlate. So it would help me if I knew that if everybody's going to fail, that's not going to be particularly helpful. But if we set that standard and move to it in 10 years, maybe people will move along in that direction. So I apologize for you, but that's what I would like to see over time, is see if we'd actually have some concrete examples of that.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's extremely helpful. Thank you.
And I know Joyce has been trying to get in for a long time, so it was my fault. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
So, what is the reason for doing this?
It's in statute.
That's what I thought. That's pretty much my answer. What do they hope to get out of this?
I mean, I think that a lot of this comes out of sort of post-NCLB from the feds when we started going into growth, and then they said, but growth to nowhere isn't enough. You actually have to have that end goal in mind and see if we're making progress towards attaining that goal. I think that we've tried a couple of different times to incorporate a growth standard measure, and it's had varying, or the previous incarnation had varying levels of success. It has some meaning for schools and districts in terms of it's a little more actionable sometimes than growth is, because you are looking at a student who is, if you know they're at, let's say, level 1, and if you know that, well, if they have 2 years to get to level 2, like what is that actually going to look like, and how do I plan for what that looks like? Because sometimes when you get a growth percentile of 50, that doesn't actually tell you a whole lot in terms of, well, what do I have to do on the ground level? So I think that there is, hopefully, like an element of, we know that that students can learn at this rate, and we need to figure out how to do that for each child.
So the how to do that is the local control, and it is actually in the hands of the individual teacher in that individual classroom with that individual child.
Yes, it is.
Okay. And does it have to be, if this is supposed to be so good, can we substitute growth for growth to standard?
Can we substitute growth?
Katie, somebody?
They're both in statute, but that's
That's
where
what-
you guys can talk about weighting and what's the importance to you.
Okay, so I guess then my question is, could we superimpose something over top of what we have that divides up just growth and growth to standards and achievement at the percentages we have for growth and achievement, just to see how that fits? And I don't know, I'm just kind of talking off the top of my head, but whatever we have, are there other states doing this right now that you know of?
So I know that there are a couple of other states that have growth to standard metrics, but not as many as have just growth metrics. Like the
Right,
growth metric is a
right.
much more
Do
popular.
the ones that have growth to standard also have growth, or is their growth to standard?
That's a good question, and I don't actually know.
Okay, that's okay. We'll find
we
that
can find
out.
out.
But here's my other thing. If they do, or if we interject this and we talk about the modeling, let's see what it looks like. I would like to see what it looks like, and I guess since we're talking about individual students, do we take a hypothetical class and do this? I don't even know if we have the numbers for any class down to the student level, even if it's, I don't want to recognize who the students, I don't really care about that right now. But modeling for the past maybe 5 years and saying, okay, what would that look like? And it seems like an awful lot of work if it's not going to, but I know we have to have the teachers working on the individual students within that 5 years, which obviously we haven't had, or we wouldn't be getting this from across the street, that we have to add this other feature. I worry about it taking away from the longitudinal information we have right now by another change in the system. And if there was another way to do it, and I don't have it right now, but it seems like a major amount of work for, I'm not quite sure of where we're going with that. So,
And
Well, it does
can-
focus, it does force the school and the teacher to focus on not only where the kid is, but where does the student need to get to be proficient?
I think our
That-
growth is pretty clear about that right now, and except for the individual student part. But I don't think a lot of the things that we are saying that, and it's very clear in statute what should be being done in the classroom is actually being done, or if the teachers are actually qualified to do what is needed, or is this just another evaluation exercise that we're doing at the state level that's not, I don't know. I don't know the answer, but it is very worrisome to me because I've been studying a lot of law and what's been going on and what education the teachers are getting, for instance, at K3, and the important parts for reading. We're not doing so well, so why would we add this other?
Well, we've never done so well there.
I don't know the answer to that.
Another focus point too is, I'm not always, but I tend to go toward the high school end of life on discussions like this. I think there's a need to have a lot more clarity on the part of everybody, parents, students, us, and about what is post-secondary readiness. And are we, if we continue, I think we've been in this cycle long enough now, maybe we know a lot more than I'm thinking I do today. But why do we have what still is perceived as, I think, it's a higher remediation rate than it really is. It seems to be there's this high, steady figure out there. We keep hearing employers say there are a bunch of skills that are in gaps. We're not finding, we don't have available what we're gonna need. I'm being more negative than I really feel about this whole thing, because there are some incredible things going on in high school programs right now that will continue to show readiness. These kids are gonna be ready. But how is that conveyed as the message and satisfies Steve's long time thing about what's the score and how do we talk about that and know what we're talking about? Here's where I
And
went
Jane,
today.
can you
with
use your
this.
mic a little bit?
So sorry. Where I went today, and it was on the first sheet, this one, that talked about the beginnings of exercises here. I started I was being led into, well, here's agreement, where we've been, sort of, about, we're looking at this first part of it, I can't see it, so I can't even remember what it was now. But by the end of the page, I got frustrated again, mostly with myself, because it felt like we're going from where we were and where this middle part said, and that at the end, it felt like it's kind of defying everything I've said today about what is growth and how do you know, is it only the lower end, the needier end that we're addressing, and how do we work in both ends and satisfy that? Just thoughts. But maybe a concrete question would be helpful. I think it was you, Marie, you were talking about and the question about do we report this or a combination of both?
I have no idea.
Well,
What's your
I don't,
question?
I'm trying to say it.
I know.
Thank you.
It's 4 o'clock, so please say your question.
Was part of that thinking around, is there a way to do one number that balances the negative of one and the positive of other, and then attach a weighting to that based on some sort of a sliding scale type of thing? My worry right now, hearing that, would be how in the heck is that going to be conveyed to people so they understand it? And I'm sure that's what you're trying to help us get to. But, you know.
I think you guys have, I mean, this is the whole, all of you have brought up the points around the complexity of this and how every little decision impacts the whole other system, right? And I mean, to Joyce's point, it's actually always been in statute, but as we've had the assessment transitions and everything, so we need to get back to it. But it was, the reason we started with growth to standard is it was that bridge, or we're hoping, as we look at the models, you know, it's that bridge for the questions you all have been asking us for many months around the alignment between student achievement and growth, and trying to bridge those things. So that is what it's supposed to, you know, be doing. But Joyce is right; it's complicated, and it adds another layer to
the
this.
alignment, Katie, between proficiency and all those greens.
Yeah.
All those performance schools and performance districts. I'm sorry that those two don't make a lot of sense.
So we have just, I know you guys are done, but do you want to go through sort of the rules, or no, we'll send you. You guys saw the last couple slides, which is sort of where we're going with this, which is when we introduce the rulemaking in the next couple weeks. These are the things that we're talking about. So it's, I mean, we've known it's going to be a heavy lift, which is why we needed to get grounded here.
How hard is it to have examples?
So
How hard is it to look at different things and to see what the effects are? Because that is part of the discussion we have. We were worried about setting.
Can you use your mic just because it's helpful to have it on the record, sorry.
We're worried about setting new weights that create a whole lot of turnaround districts, more than we can even begin to help. And is that really where we need to be going? Is the growth to standard telling us that we need to be having that many more districts that need supports, et cetera? I mean,
Right, so we need to get the models.
I think we really need the models for those of us who need to see some of the specifics as opposed to just the big picture, the philosophical picture.
The challenge for us has been how you define the model will really determine what kind of impact data you're looking at. If we set, you know, very high targets and very short timelines, I guarantee you it'll have a huge impact on the number of schools that are priority improvement or turnaround. And if we do the opposite, then it'll have a different impact. So what we were trying to do was get a little further in terms of with you guys in terms of like how the model has currently been proposed, and if you're okay with those basic concepts before we try to dive into, and this is how your performance framework ratings will change. Because if you don't actually like the components of the growth to standard metric we've proposed, then it's not really worth getting into the impact data. But I totally understand your point, and we will make sure that we come back with specific examples and in potentially
it's
use
hard
those
be-
as like a jumping off point.
It's really hard because there are some philosophical commitments that you make or don't make to some kids.
Exactly.
Growth, depending on what we do.
Yes.
Right.
And so the board members need to be comfortable that we say that we
Right.
accept that it's gonna take longer
Right.
Yep.
than we did under the old model.
And
Right.
there might be some philosophical differences among you guys too. So I think we need to, I think our work is after this discussion, which we did get a lot of feedback from.
Yes.
And we
This has been
heard,
helpful,
we
thank you.
heard some philosophical pieces. So I think we need to get it together as a staff and say, here are the 4 models we're gonna run that kind of
Fair.
show the
That's totally
different
fair.
philosophical differences.
Yep.
You know, and then just use that as a starting place.
Exactly.
I think use that as a starting place to say, okay, now can you tweak it like this? Now can you tweak
Exactly.
it like that? And the only other point I want to get in before your folks start leaving is this is why we didn't put a hard stop on the timeline. This is so fundamental to the entire system. It's so fundamental to how we support districts. It's so fundamental to how districts communicate with their community that this is important stuff. So we're gonna open the rulemaking in 2 weeks, but know that you don't have a limit. Like, we can do this. I mean, 191 rulemaking took 9 months. So we can take the time we need to run the models
Yep.
and bring you more examples. You don't have to feel rushed, and I would prefer you don't rush. As we start introducing these things over time, this is one of the
Yes.
most fundamental pieces of our system, and we can't, we don't
So-
want to rush it.
It is not true that there is a certain time limit once we introduce them, because I thought we got ourselves in trouble when.
We
What-
just need to have the hearing on the day that we say that we're gonna have a hearing, but then you can keep, calling for additional hearings.
We can, so we can get input from affected districts also on a continuous
Yep.
basis. Okay.
Yep. Yeah, there's
Okay.
nothing, I mean, I think what you're worried about is like when OLLS comes back to us and say you need to change the rule. I mean, there's some of that, but I feel like if we are moving forward and the rules are open and you guys are doing the work, it's a different thing
I
than
think
like
what
you
got us
haven't
messed up
opened the
before was
rules.
something didn't get filed.
Yeah.
We actually voted and it didn't get filed in time. We had to start over. And I just wanna make sure we don't get into that
Yes.
pickle.
Yeah.
I suppose by next May, like May of 2020, if we don't have rules in place, they could say your rules don't align with statute.
Well, some of this is based on the current statute, but we don't have the growth to standard metric in there because of our assessment transition. So now that we've transitioned, we need to get back in compliance. We had it before we had an assessment transition, and then it went away because the assessment transition means you can no longer calculate a growth to standard because you're changing assessments. Now that we've had a couple years of the assessment, we can now calculate it again. So now we need to.
No,
No, we
13
changed, we actually are
Yeah,
changing the growth to.
1355 changed the language that was in previously in terms of how that's defined, and what it really did was give it to you all and the TAP to use the data to come up with something that makes a little bit more, it's a little more grounded in the actual data that we see in the state. So that law gave you guys more work.
Is there some new obligation on this specifically for ESSA, reporting or filing, and do we have to
No.
Not for,
send?
Yeah, this is
them?
purely for state.
Yeah, ESSA doesn't have growth to standard.
Only for ELP students, and we took care of that.
Yeah.
If you want to delegate it to us, you can. No.
yeah.
Lemons.
Yeah, but
I don't know. Okay, is there anything else you guys? Okay.
Where's your gavel?
So, I do think we need to officially adjourn then, and since you're, so.
Yeah.
You'll get to be seeing a lot of us.